All right. Thanks, Andrew and Kathy and Lisa and Aaron. That was a great discussion, and we think that the hour we spent talking about what's going on at the federal level was very informative. There's obviously a change afoot, and sometimes it's a little hard to predict what that change will result in, but I think generally we were hearing a lot of optimism about more emphasis and focus on energy and grid related issues. And so we look forward to seeing what 2021 brings. We want to transition now. I want to turn the stage over to Karen Wayland and former Governor of Colorado, Bill Ritter, to join us on stage. And they'll probably talk a little bit about what's going on at the national level, but I think they'll also talk a lot about what's going on at the state, regional, local level, because there's just been so much activity there over the last couple of years that I think is important to what's happening across the industry. So Karen Wayland is a senior policy advisor to the GridWise Alliance. We're happy to have her as part of our team, and I'll turn it over to her and let her introduce the governor. Thanks, Karen and Bill. Did we lose Karen? I see you, Bill. I don't see Karen. We lost her.
I think we did.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce you, Governor. Oh, there she is. Sorry,
Karen. Did we lose Steve? Can you hear me, Governor?
I can hear you, yeah, and I think I can hear Steve. My monitor picked it up, but I don't know, for some reason I'm now looking at my screen, but my camera on my monitors or on my laptop is the one picking it up. So I'll try and do this by changing and just looking at my laptop.
So do we have Steve, or should we just go ahead and start?
We still have Steve. He was just giving you a chance to introduce me.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, then, I'm Karen Wayland. I'm the policy advisor of the GridWise Alliance. And I don't think you need an introduction, Governor, but I will give a brief one.
I don't need one. You're right. So
yeah, you were the 41st governor of Colorado, and you currently lead the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, in which you work with state and federal policymakers on clean energy policy. I think that's when we first started interacting, when I was at the Department of Energy, and I established Secretary Monize's state and local policy office, and that was in a recognition that so much of the work on energy policy is happening at the state level, and that's particularly true over the last 4 years, where there was virtually no progress on climate policy at the federal level. In fact, I think there was a fair amount of work to impede the work that the states were doing. But we now have a president-elect who's coming in with the strongest climate platform in the history of an incoming president, and that includes a pledge to get us to zero carbon electricity by 2035. And that's what we wanted to talk about today, which is, how do we get there over the next decade? What do we need to do to set the stage? But I want to give our audience a little bit of a time check here. We're going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. And then at 4:45 Eastern time, or 1:45 Pacific time, the governor and I are going to go over to the networking session. So you can have an opportunity right before the end of today's program to interact with us and other participants. So stay tuned for that. So Governor, how do we get there? What needs to happen over the next decade to get us to 2035?
That's interesting. The Biden plan came out with a 2035 goal, the campaign plan for net zero in the electricity sector. And I think everybody that I know, including people who are now in the transition, understand what a stretch goal that is, how difficult that's going to be for the utility sector. So I think the fair thing to say, and we entitled this Opportunities and Challenges in the Power Sector for the next decade. I think one of the most important things is to realize that 57 different major utilities or power producers in America now have targets or goals that involve 2025, more likely 2030, 2035, 2040, and 2050. And anybody that has a 2050 goal has a zero, either zero or net zero carbon. So the power industry has transitioned in a pretty big way. I'd like to say it was probably led by Xcel Energy, which made its own announcement of an 80% reduction of emissions by 2030. So what that means, Karen, from its 2005 emissions, is we're going to have a massive transition that happens here. And I think it'd be fair to say the power sector would say, we're probably going to take down as much coal as we can, as rapidly as we can in the next 10 years. We're going to replace that with whatever we can that is carbon free. And that means a lot of renewables, wind, solar, storage, possibly geothermal. And there may be some other zero carbon technologies that over the course of time that we already know about, that they become affordable or economical, perhaps because of different policy levers pushed at the federal level, perhaps because of policy levers pushed at the state and local level. But that's the number one thing. Over the next 10 years, it's going to be a massive infusion or a massive transition, but it's going to be a cash infusion as well, a capital infusion, because the build out of things that will have to be necessitated to replace coal, which they're going to take down. And much of it has to do with these targets that they've set. That's the first thing. The second thing, most CEOs who have set these targets will tell you, we don't know how to get to net zero, or we don't know how to get to 100% clean, whatever they've set as their own targets, or whatever the state has set for them and required of them. Here in Colorado, we've got a combination of clean energy plans and a climate plan, that's an emissions reduction across all sectors. Everybody in states that are doing this climate planning, this emissions reduction, will tell you they're going to require more of the power sector than the other sort of harder to decarbonize sectors, like the industrial sector or the agricultural sector. Yes, they're going to try and do all they can to accelerate the decarbonization of the transportation sector, but that's very much going to impact the power sector because of the electrification of transportation that's going to happen. So I'd say if we look at the 10-year window, we're going to see a big transition happening. But unless we also now in 2020 begin to think about 2035 or 2040 and begin to understand the importance that innovation will play in that, we're going to, we can't start to decarbonize the rest of it, the other 20% in 2035 or 2040. We need to start planning that now.
So you talked about, a massive investment. Do you think that if there were a national signal, for example, a clean energy standard, or some even just, a leadership message coming from the White House, that private capital alone would get us to this massive investment that we need over the next decade? Or are we going to need some sort of federal help as well?
Yeah, I just think this is such a mix of policy, of innovation around technology, and then utilizing financial instruments, most of which will be private sector based, but could be levered by federal policy or state policy as well. I think it's kind of like a chemistry equation. Like there's not a single thing that's going to get us there. Even if there's a signal coming from the White House that this is the thing we desire, we're going to have a mix. And, I think we watched state renewable portfolio standards. They were sort of the early policy lever in 2004, 2006, 2008. And what we saw, and we'll take Colorado as an example, I signed in 2010, much to the chagrin of a lot of naysayers, the renewable portfolio standard for 30% by 2020. Well, that was a policy lever. But what happened was the economies of scale in building out a renewable portfolio really took over at some point, and it became the market that drove the build out after the 30%. So Xcel Energy said, we're going to get to 30% by 2020. Let's go to 55% by 2025 because of the downward decline in prices. And I think, there are going to be signals that will come out of the White House. It may still be difficult to pass those kind of broad policy measures like a clean energy standard, depending upon who controls the United States Senate, depending upon where the votes are in the House. We might have that ability, but let's say it's going to be difficult. So whatever signal comes out of the White House, it's still going to take a mix of policy levers, a mix of innovation on the part of the research and development sectors in this country, both public and private. And then it's going to take the right kind of financial packages.
So If we think about getting to 2035, getting to 2040 goals, there are a host of available technologies that utilities are already deploying, and those will help us get to the 2035. But there's some massive infrastructure that's going to need to be built to accommodate what we are hoping to see in those goals. So, for example, particularly in the short term, we're going to need more transmission. In the longer term, if we start looking at hydrogen or carbon capture and sequestration for some of the really hard to decarbonize industries, that requires steel in the ground. That requires siting and permitting. It requires consensus with communities. It requires, state action as well as in coordination with federal action. Can we spend a little bit of time talking about how we're going to have to build faster in order to meet our goals, both our short and our long-term goals?
Yeah, Karen, I think this is such a fascinating place where you and I agree that we are going to have to do it faster. We say build faster. We're actually going to have to permit faster. And part of that is going to have to be streamlining some things at the federal level. During the Clean Power Plan, I was convening all the Western states, both utilities, governor's offices, utility commissioners, and the state of Idaho said, well, listen, it took us 13 years to permit a transmission line that we badly needed to upgrade our system. And to, if you're going to put massive new renewables on, that's going to cause you alone to have to update your electricity transmission system. And it took them 13 years. So we went to the White House and talked to folks in the Obama administration and said, listen, it can't take 13 years. We have to do this in a streamlined fashion, because the goal for the Clean Power Plan was actually to get something done, in 12 years past the 2018 date, which was the final date of states submitting their implementation plans. And it's like, we have to do this differently. So the permitting alone has to happen in a quicker fashion than we've contemplated before. And we don't want to run afoul of NEPA. We don't want to run afoul of the environmental impact statements, but we need to have all hands on deck at the federal and state level to try and get this done in a quicker way. But that's not just true of transmission lines, as you alluded to. It's going to be true of pipelines, particularly if we have to build out, a different kind of a pipeline highway in this country. And people are talking about hydrogen as a part of that. There's certainly hydrogen we could put into natural gas to clean up, the natural gas emissions a little bit. But, the operating number is probably at a max of 20%. And so if you're going to do an all hydrogen highway, that's really going to require a completely different type of infrastructure than we currently have on the ground. And we're going to have to, ask ourselves now if that's sort of the path forward for us. And those are decisions that we have to be making in the early part of this decade in order to do what we need to do to decarbonize by 2035 or 2040.
So, you and I think, had talked before about the solar energy zones and that the Department of Interior established a few years ago. And just for the audience, here in Nevada, the first of the solar facilities that was built in a solar energy zone was designed, permitted, constructed, and turned on in less than 3 years. And you mentioned 13 years to get a transmission line built. That difference can exist if we are planning, as you said, for massive deployment of utility scale renewables now, and we can get those built in 3 to 5 years, but we can't get the transmission built for 13 years. And you also mentioned, and you work with states and local policymakers so much, you mentioned the role of the states here. I was having a conversation with some people on the DOE transition team this week, and they were asking about what DOE can do to help states, and maybe you have some thoughts on absent a large, we can talk about whether we're going to get a big stimulus package or not, but under a regular appropriation scenario with no new authorizations, what is it that the federal government can do to help the states both meet their goals and facilitate the process for siting and permitting?
Well, I don't want to take the possibility of a stimulus package that addresses some clean energy goals off the table. I think there were a lot of good parts to the Recovery Act, as you know, Karen, that helped us with respect to building out some clean energy economies in different places across the country, and the states were really responsible for that. There were some parts to it that did not work as well, that were rather inefficient, and I think there have been some lesson learned that we could borrow if there is stimulus coming. But letting the states be sort of the administrator of those programs and really letting the states tailor make those for the state's needs, I think that's a good part of it. The other thing that I think is so important about this is if you do that, states are also pretty in tune with how to create a workforce or workforce development, and I'd say better attuned than the federal government. In addition to that, states can absolutely partner with the federal government on trying to site both projects, but also on trying to site transmission. Probably important all over the country. It's certainly important in the West, where you have states like Nevada, the state that you're currently in, has 85% of its land is federal land or public land. In Colorado, it's 45%. That's still really massive amounts of federal land compared to other states in the country, particularly those that are sort of west of the interconnect, the Western interconnect. But Idaho's 66%. So we absolutely need to have a federal partner who's helping us to ensure that all the environmental protections are in place, but also that we're streamlining the permitting of that and able to get it done. And I think the what you just described, that the Obama administration actually put in place with zones where you could build on public land, both solar and wind development, is a really important part of the discussion for building out massive amounts of renewable, but also building out transmission lines and pipelines.
Yeah, you mentioned Nevada. We say we have, we not just have rural, we have remote here. So yeah. We are getting some great questions. I have one more question before I want to turn to the audience questions, and that is that we are fortunately, I think, reaching a turning point where the issues of equity and justice in investments and in policy have really risen to the forefront, and we've seen President-elect Biden talk about the need for at least 40% of the benefits of climate investments to go to communities that haven't traditionally felt those benefits. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what climate justice means in the power sector. What does equity mean, as we make these big investments going forward the next decade and a half?
Yeah, so I think there are several parts to it, and I'm really I don't know how to say this. I'm very much gratified that the power sector is considering this issue so seriously. There are so many CEOs that have said this is very important to them. And, again, our biggest utility, XL Energy, is actually based in Minneapolis. Their home office is a few blocks from where George Floyd was killed. And Ben Falk, their CEO, has been very, very adamant about making sure that whether it's called climate justice or environmental justice or just pure justice, racial justice, is a part of thinking about this. And, so in my work with environmental justice groups, they've often said utilities, their whole discussion about marginal communities ends with keeping energy prices affordable, that they're customers, right? And they want to make sure that in marginalized communities, they can still afford it. Those communities want something far more than that. They want affordable energy. But in addition to that, they don't want to be the communities where if you have some kind of, let's say, cap and trade program, you still have fossil fuels that you're able to run because you're trading away credits or buying credits, and you're a major utility, that the last fossil fuel plants taken down are left up in marginal communities, which are paying a public health price for having them in their community. So they want that to be part of the conversation. In addition, they want there to be thinking about how do they play as part of the workforce. How can there be a focus on ensuring that communities of color or marginalized communities or disadvantaged communities are actually, brought into this workforce in a way differently than they have been in the past. And finally, they talk about wealth creation inside of the communities. how can you ensure that if there is this massive infusion of capital into this transition, that some of that finds its way, or not just some of it, but a significant part of it finds its way into the community. So it is affordability, but it's also the workforce, and it's cash infusion that actually creates wealth in those communities. And then it's ensuring that we're thinking about public health issues in those communities by what plants are left in place, what they're still emitting, and who's paying the price for those emissions.
Yeah, I was just recently part of discussions about electric vehicle infrastructure and utility investments in electric vehicle infrastructure. And the environmental justice community was very concerned that the investments would not be in areas where they could take advantage of them. And so they did a very simple exercise where they mapped out where people lived who spoke, where 25% or less people were not speaking English as a native language, where the poverty level was, and where students in schools got 100% free lunch. And it turns out when they mapped that out, it overlaid very well with the places where we would think we'd want to put charging infrastructure, with some tweaks that would have to be addressing, where people live, where they don't have their own garages, and charging, home residential charging. But it was thinking about those issues from the get-go before a bill got introduced that I think was critical, and then actually putting some visualization to it so that you could actually see where money would benefit these communities. I think is going to be really important thinking through it. So that was really interesting. And now we have really amazing questions. Leslie is asking about the approach to public-private partnerships in rural areas where it can be very challenging to attract private investment. And I'm sure, given all your work out west, you've got some thoughts on how to make sure the rural areas, we're not leaving them behind.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, right? There's actually a book called The Left Behind, and it's more about sort of the political chasm that can exist between rural and urban, but the feeling that people, number one, feel left behind. I think there's so many parts of this transition that need to involve our thinking about how to ensure that there's a regenerative economy in rural America. So much of what we have done is extract. We extract oil, we extract gas from rural America, we extract coal, we extract crops, quite frankly. The ag economy is an extraction economy in many respects, but we think that there are ways for us to think about rural America and the benefits that they can have. In the West, we have a variety, and the Midwest, we have a variety of places where farmers and ranchers have been able to take big advantage of the wind economy, the build out of wind energy, with lease payments on private land. Most of Colorado's wind, we only had 200 and some megawatts of wind when I was first elected in 2007. And I think we're going to get to like 5,500 megawatts. It's still daunting to look and see what Texas has been able to build out. But most of what we've built out in Colorado has been on private land where farmers have lease agreements with the power producers, and they're making significant amount of money if they dedicate a little bit of land to it. People talk about, the footprint of land. Well, we have a farmer who has 11,000 acres. He only has 68 acres out of production for 100 turbines, and he's making $500,000 a year. We need to think about in our planning how we ensure that farmers understand the benefits of building out a wind economy and building out a solar economy, building out a storage economy, and ensure that they participate in that. The real interesting part here is there's a variety of things within the Department of Agriculture that are intended to incentivize sort of this mix. So that's solar and wind. But Karen, we've never even touched what we can do with biodigester, with doing the kind of biodigesters that can really do a variety of things to turn methane on large operations into different kinds of gas to sell on the renewable energy credit market. There are dairy farmers in this country that are milking, a couple 100,000 cows at different operations that have figured this out, and they're running all of their equipment on fuel that is a renewable natural gas, but also building their own turbines and net metering back onto the power line. Those are things beyond what we've been able to do with wind and solar that are going to benefit a rural economy. And we just need to ensure that message is there for rural America.
I think there are so many multiple benefits to the biofuels issue. You know, you're talking about large confined animal operations, and one of their biggest liabilities are their waste pools. And if you start to have an economy that looks at that waste as potential input for energy, it has a different value proposition for how you manage that waste. And so there are multiple benefits there, I think.
It's a really fair question, because we had one of the largest biodigesters in America, and we had a county commission in that particular county. It's a big oil and gas county. They were unfavorably disposed toward it, and they found a way to actually shut it down. And it was unfortunate because they were creating a topsoil, they were creating a fertilizer, but they were also putting renewable natural gas into a pipeline and selling that onto the REC market in California, and able to trade RECs for it. And it was a going concern. Now it's back up and operating again. It won a federal lawsuit, but you know, it was a rural county that liked oil and gas a lot better, that actually found a way to shut it down. So that's still this challenge that we have in America about how to incorporate rural America in this energy transition.
Yeah. And in fact, I think that President-elect Biden is talking about having a rural czar in the White House, which I think will be a big improvement in terms of trying to open up a dialogue with those communities about the benefits of being part of addressing the climate change crisis. We have a question for Susan about the distribution grid and the changes that need to be made to accommodate local renewables there. She said, utilities don't want to pay for this. What other options do you see?
Well, you know, that's a difficult one, because utilities, many of them are regulated, you know, at the state level, and build out of transmission is something that they've been able to, if they're an investor-owned utility and they're regulated, they've been able to get as part of their rate base. But power producers are also an important part of this, and those that aren't regulated, they have to decide that it's economic for them to go ahead and build it out. I mean, there's some options here, right? The government could do this as part of the build out of a national infrastructure improvement, but it's either going to be the government or the private sector, or it's going to be a partnership between the two that we somehow incentivize through legislation. But I agree that it actually has to happen. We found, you know, we have a great example in Colorado where we had this renewable portfolio standard. Xcel began buying from, at the time it was NextEra, and or no, I'm sorry, at the time it's Florida Power and Light, and they built a wind farm, and they built their own transmission line. It became so profitable for them, they came back and doubled the size of the wind farm, but they had to build and pay for the transmission line. But there was enough of a reason to ensure that there's going to be an offtake, because they had a portfolio standard that the utility had to meet within a date certain. And so I think, again, there's some policy ways for us to do this, but just to tell the utility to go ahead and build out the last mile is not going to be enough. We're going to have to find ways to incentivize that in financial packages to do it, both for investor-owned utilities and for the public power producers.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you know, I've got a utility client that tells me that they want to do these things. They just have to be told to do it by policymakers and regulators so that they can actually make the investments, justify them, and then get a return on investments. So, and I thought it was interesting in the last panel, Kathy Steckleberg was talking about some of the EEI members taking advantage of the Recovery Act grants that they got, and that they went back to their public utility commissions, were able to say, you know, we've got this infusion of federal money to help us. And we have been developing at GridWise a package of grid investments for an economic recovery if Congress does decide to do, you know, round 2 of a Recovery Act, you know, in 2021. And a lot of the investments that we are recommending that Congress make would go through the Department of Energy in cost share programs to the utilities. And our vision is that those would both help accelerate the utility grid modernization plans, but also de-risk those decisions that the public utility commissions are going to have to make, particularly going forward in the next 2 years when the state budgets are going to be so strapped, when so many people are having trouble paying their bills. I don't see any way that we actually get the investments that we need unless there is a federal component to it that helps move things along faster.
Yeah, either that or just outright mandating the build out of it as part of, you know, a clean energy standard or a renewable portfolio standard. And I don't advocate for that, because I think that is part of what causes this chasm. This sort of, it's why, you know, people don't buy into it. They think that federal or state mandates that are just pure mandates actually are wrong. And it will, I think, increase sort of the divide we find ourselves in sometimes with the politicization of that. So like you said, finding ways to incentivizing this and making it a market-based conversation about how this increases the market and how it improves the economics is the thing that I would advocate. And it sounds like you're working on it already, which is great.
We are. For those who are watching, you can find on the GridWise website the latest draft of our grid modernization investments recommendations for Congress. We've been having a lot of fruitful conversations with people on the Hill. And I think Gil Quinones mentioned earlier this morning that it was a $50 billion package. It started off at $25 billion and is at the request of the Hill. We've actually increased it to $50 billion, including some of the provisions. So I certainly hope we get a chance to debate whether we're talking about a $25 billion or a $50 billion investment. We have a question from Sam, who says that 70% of federally assisted housing is within a mile of Superfund sites. Environmental justice is a multifaceted housing policy, meets energy policy and more. How do we create the collaboration between departments and industries to synthesize the on-the-ground climate and energy policy solutions?
Yeah, I'd say that one of the things that we have to achieve as a starting point is to make sure we're listening to impacted communities. You know, I think if you take back, and I'm probably, you know, one of the people on this call born in the 50s, when the Eisenhower plan for developing the interstate highway system was hatched, they went right through so many communities and they divided them in two and forever changed, and I would say made them inferior because they didn't listen to communities. This is an opportunity for us to decide how we build out a different energy system. And while it was already complicated by issues around emissions reduction, so we can't use, you know, 1960s or 70 technology or even early 1980 technology to build this out. We have to be very conscientious about emissions, about fossil fuels, about the impact on climate. But then we have to layer on top of that the public health cost, the detriment of fossil fuels being in marginalized communities. And that means that as we do what we need to do to build this out, we have to be sitting in those places, whether they're, you know, public housing places or other kinds of disadvantaged communities, and asking them about how we build this out. And that has to be, I think, a federal and state partnership and a willingness to do that. It's not going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. But Sam, I would argue that the way you posited the question is exactly the right way. And we got to ask, you know, people who are doing this stuff, both legislating at the federal and the state level, what their willingness is to ensure that there are people sitting in those communities who are listening and not talking.
Gwendolyn is asking, is there an interest nationally to alter the transmission payment structure to provide ongoing compensation to host landowners as is done for the hosts of generation assets?
So I don't know the answer to that, Karen. You may know that better than I do, but I know it's part of the conversation because it hasn't happened that way before. And imagine if you have a wind farm and you have a purchase power agreement that's 20 years long and you put a turbine up and you get a 20 years worth of payment on that, the kind of surety that that brings to a landowner, to a farmer, rancher landowner who's decided to build a wind farm there, it really makes such a difference in their own financial stability, particularly in an industry, an ag industry that can be, you know, difficult year to year to year to year, depending upon a lot of different weather conditions. It could help in a big way, give people I think the insurance that they need to decide to allow transmission to be built on their land.
Yeah, I am a farmer as well, and I have been looking at, I rent out the farm that we had, that I grew up on, and have been looking at what is charged for an acre, depending on whether it's livestock or hay or crops, and it's on the order of like $50 to $106 an acre. So there's no way that a farmer in many instances can make, you know, in a bad year can make ends meet, and so I think the USDA really helping to facilitate the conversations around energy, the relationship with energy production and energy transmission would be, you know, very good for the rural communities. we have a question on that's kind of a follow-up in terms of the partnerships and streamlining. Is guidance on public lands process forthcoming? I think that there are some moves in the Trump administration. They have made some changes to permitting and siting, but I suspect that the Biden administration is going to want to review those. And I also think that they're going to reinvigorate the Council on Environmental Quality, which is where a lot of the NEPA discussions get coordinated. But I don't know if you've got any thoughts on what you're hearing about the public lands processes.
Well, I think there were a variety of things done that related to public lands that are going to be at least reversed if they're still in litigation. It's going to be the position for the United States government will change. So, there was a moratorium on coal leasing that was lifted. I don't know where that is in the litigation, but I think we're going to probably go back to that. President-elect Biden's been very clear about a moratorium on fracking on public lands that I think is probably will see that. We had methane rules that were developed both by the Environmental Protection Agency generally, but also by the Department of Interior for BLM lands. They were the subject of a lot of targeting. And again, where they are in sort of the litigation process, I don't know, but those are the kinds of things that you'll see unwound first. Interestingly, the Trump administration, I don't think ever got to this whole rule that was right at the very end of the Obama administration that had to do with siting, the thing that you've referenced about how we could streamline siting on public lands for wind and solar and storage. And so I think that's still all intact, but there is going to be a variety of things that will happen in the Biden administration that will be kind of rollbacks of the rollbacks or a change in the litigation posture for those. And those are probably going to be the first order of business. And then a look at how we utilize public lands to develop renewable sources or carbon-free sources is going to be a big part of it. Obviously, Karen, something we haven't talked about, this net zero goal of 2035 has a big question mark, and that's the role of natural gas. And in fairness to the utilities, they will say, we want power to be reliable, we want it to be affordable, and we want it to be sustainable. And to take down as much coal as we've had, there are places in this country where we haven't had access to renewables, so we've replaced it with lower emissions natural gas. And they're only really lower emissions if you're carbon capturing, methane along the value chain. But I think the new build of gas is something that the utility sector is going to say we have to do that for reliability's sake, while we do the other kinds of innovation that are necessary to get us to zero carbon. And I think the utility sector also is going to probably have to say, if we do build new gas, we're going to have a plan for how we decarbonize that in a time certain, because the lifetime of that plant is going to extend beyond where we need to be zero carbon. And secondly, as the buyer of that gas, we need to assure that the upstream producers are doing everything they can to get to zero methane leakage along the value chain before they sell it to us.
I thought it was very interesting that about 18 months ago or so now at this point, the National Petroleum Council, which is the group of oil and gas industry executives that advises the Secretary of Energy, they put out a report on the future of oil and gas transmission infrastructure in the country. And in their siting and permitting chapter, they came to a unanimous that all of those decisions about siting oil and gas infrastructure, particularly gas infrastructure, which has been the issue that's seen a lot of attention at FERC, that all of those siting decisions really should be made under the constraint of a national climate, so that you're actually really thinking about where infrastructure goes, what it's connected to, the message. So I think the industry has come a long way, and we didn't get any questions on that, but you and I have had conversations about the changing posture of a whole host of sectors of the economy recognizing the inevitability of having to deal with climate. Maybe you have some thoughts you'd like to articulate.
No, I think you're exactly right. And there have been so many big battles over new pipelines, Dakota Access, Keystone, those are such big battles. But I think, an acknowledgement on the part of the industry that we shouldn't build it unless we need it, unless we absolutely need it, and that should be an index for FERC to use going forward for the build out of it. I think there's still going to be a real fight about how much new gas there should be. But I do understand those people in the utility sector who will say, listen, we want to keep it reliable and we need to have some new build out. And they, they have to be able to demonstrate why they have to have that. If we already have existing gas structure that helps with reliability, what's the need for the new? But to the extent they can make their case that they need a new build out, then I think an agreement on their part also that they've got to decarbonize that by a date certain. And that's part of not just the Biden plan, but what we should have both as a national climate plan and a national energy plan.
Right. Which is a great segue to Ron's question about assuming the Dems don't gain control of the Senate, what types of executive orders can Biden take to further both clean energy and grid modernization goals?
Yeah, so my center worked with the Obama administration on a project, we called it Powering Forward. And then I wrote a book called Powering Forward, what everyone needs to know about America's energy revolution. But we borrowed the name from the report to the Obama administration where we made 220 recommendations about things that could be done with renewable energy, with energy efficiency, with natural gas and rulemaking natural gas, alternative vehicles, and then finally with utility business models. And so we're going to go back and we're going to dust that off and see if there's much left to be done now, and especially after 4 years of the Trump administration, we suspect there is, but it's really innumerable, the kinds of things you can do through executive action and do legally. And some of them are fairly simple. I mean, the Department of Defense is the biggest energy user in the federal government, and the federal government's the biggest energy user in the world, if you take just entities. And so there's a variety of things just inside the Department of Defense you could do to increase energy efficiency, to bring renewables. And many of the departments were doing this, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, they're all a part of this. And then it's kind of been slowed down. So you just take the Department of Defense and what you could do. If you look at energy buildings and say, let's go back to a model using energy service companies to come in and audit these buildings and to ensure that we're doing everything we can, and then change the rules inside of OMB about how that gets credited so that you're not taking the advantage of that over a 10-year period, but making the payment all up front. It doesn't pencil out when you do it that way. There are different ways inside of OMB that you can take an energy services company and the work that they can do to improve energy efficiency and make it pencil out as long as you don't use the current rule that we use. There are just little things like that, but there's like 200 of them.
Yeah, and I think a big thing from my standpoint, having been in the administration, is the discussions about having a team of people led by a domestic climate czar, if you want to call it a czar, really coordinating across agencies. So, for example, if the Department of Transportation is going to give out grants to for electric vehicle charging infrastructure on alternative fuels corridors, then the Department of Energy is giving out grants for grid modernization. You want to make sure that the grid where the EV infrastructure is going in can accommodate the new infrastructure. And so, having a real coordination, for example, there are billions of dollars of federal financing available at different departments, and you could sit at the White House and say that, with the commitment of a 40% of the benefits going into disadvantaged communities, you could look at those financing and not just loan guarantee programs and things like that, but things like investments in watershed management restoration. Those things, if you look at where they can make a difference, where an influx of capital of federal funding will help drive economic development at the local level, but coordinating that in the White House, I think, will really leverage the government's ability to drive change, but to smooth the transition and actually to get some equity outcomes. I think we are at 1:45, and Richie, I think, wants to close the day out, but I want to remind everybody that we are going to go over into the networking part on your left-hand side. And if you've experimented with it, you'll be meeting lots of different people for just either a few seconds, or you can extend the conversation. And we'll all be over there until 5 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Richie, thanks. Thank you, Governor.
Thanks, Karen.
Governor, as well.